It's too late. He's gone. Sophie's voice shattered the sterile silence of the clinic as the heart monitor's steady hum turned into a terrifying, flatline scream. The medical staff pulled back, their faces masks of defeated pity. Blaze, the legendary German shepherd who had just saved a hostage from a blade, lay motionless on the metal table, his golden fur soaked in crimson. But then the trauma bay doors didn't just open, they exploded. Detective Brandon Shaw charged in, his uniform torn and blood-stained, eyes burning with a fierce, desperate loyalty that silenced the room. He didn't look at the monitors, he looked only at his partner. "Not today, Blaze. Not like this," he growled. Brandon stepped to the table and began a technique so classified it didn't exist in any medical textbook. A method born from the shadows of elite military K-9 units that defied every known law of biology. What happened next forced the doctors to question everything they knew about life and death, and it's a moment you have to see to believe. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The rain didn't just fall in Metro City that night, it punished the windows of the Riverside Veterinary Trauma Center. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp sting of antiseptic and the heavy, metallic scent of fresh blood. It was 4:12 a.m., the dead hour, and for the staff on duty, the silence of the room was heavier than the storm outside. Minutes earlier, a K-9 transport had screeched to a halt, delivering the city's most decorated tracker. Blaze, a 4-year-old German shepherd, was a silhouette of stillness under the harsh fluorescent lights. He had taken a blade meant for a hostage during a high-stakes standoff, and the price of his bravery was written in the red pools staining the white surgical sheets. Dr. Marcus Hale, the lead surgeon, stepped back from the table, his shoulders dropping with the weight of a battle lost. At 55, Hale had saved hundreds of animals, but he knew when a heart had given its last. Beside him, Sophie Caldwell, the paramedic who had fought to keep Blaze alive in the ambulance, stood with her hands trembling, covered in the dog's blood. She had seen the toughest officers break, but the sight of this hero lying cold was too much. "I'm calling it," Dr. Hale whispered, his voice thick with regret. "Time of death, 4:12 a.m. He's gone, Sophie." Sophie let out a jagged sob, clutching her chest. The room felt hollow, the grief of the loss already settling like ash. But the mourning lasted only seconds. The front doors slammed against the walls with a violent crash. Detective Brandon Shaw stormed into the bay like a force of nature. At 35, Brandon was a man built of grit and shadows, but today his composure was shattered. His tactical vest was shredded, his face streaked with soot, and his gray eyes were wide with a raw, unshielded pain. He didn't wait for permission. He didn't listen to the apologies. He shoved past the surgeons, his boots skidding on the wet floor, and gripped the edge of the table. To anyone else it was a corpse. To Brandon, it was the partner who had saved his soul after he lost everything 2 years ago. "He isn't finished," Brandon breathed, his jaw tight as he positioned his hands in a strange rhythmic configuration over Blaze's ribs. "And I'm not letting him go." As he began the forbidden pressure cascade technique, the room held its breath, waiting for a miracle that medical science said was impossible. The clock on the dashboard of the Metro City K-9 transport flickered to 3:47 a.m., the numbers casting a sickly green glow over the blood-spattered interior. Outside, the city was a blur of smeared neon and rain-slicked asphalt, but inside the back of the rig, the world had narrowed down to the diameter of a single pulsing wound. "Stay with me, Blaze. You stay with me, you hear me?" Sophie Caldwell's voice was raw, a jagged edge of sound cutting through the rhythmic, mechanical whine of the sirens. She was 29 years old, a seasoned paramedic who had seen every flavor of human misery Metro City had to offer, but this was different. Beneath her trembling, gore-slicked hands lay 75 pounds of elite German shepherd. Blaze, a 4-year-old tracking dog with a coat the color of autumn leaves and midnight, wasn't just property or a canine asset. He was the dog who had tracked a kidnapped toddler through 6 miles of freezing marshland last November. He was the dog who spent his off-duty hours resting his heavy head on Detective Brandon Shaw's lap, the only thing keeping the man's post-traumatic demons at bay. And now, Blaze was emptying out onto the floor of the ambulance. The standoff at the downtown warehouse had gone south in a heartbeat. A cornered fugitive, a serrated hunting knife, and a hostage whose life hung by a thread. Blaze hadn't hesitated. He had launched himself through the air, a blur of fur and fury, taking the blade meant for the young woman's throat. The knife had found the soft tissue beneath his tactical vest, severing the femoral artery with a precision that felt personal. Sophie worked with a desperate, frantic rhythm. She had performed emergency field surgery on humans in the middle of active gang wars, but a dog's anatomy under stress was a different beast. She had a hemostat clamped onto what she hoped was the primary bleeder, her knuckles white as she applied direct pressure to the gaping wound in the dog's hindquarter. "How far?" she screamed toward the front. 2 minutes, the driver yelled back, his voice tight. "Hang on, Sophie. I'm taking the corners as flat as I can." Blaze's breathing was shallow, a series of wet, thready rasps. His once bright eyes were rolled back, showing the slivers of white, and his tongue lolled uselessly from the side of his mouth. Sophie felt a hot tear track through the soot and sweat on her cheek. She reached up with one bloodied hand to stroke the dog's velvet soft ear. "You're a hero, Blaze. Don't you dare quit. Brandon is coming. He's right behind us." 3 miles away, a blacked-out Dodge Charger roared through a red light, its engine screaming in protest as it pushed past 90 miles per hour. Detective Brandon Shaw gripped the steering wheel so hard the leather groaned. His knuckles were bone-white, his jaw set in a mask of suppressed agony. In his peripheral vision, the empty passenger seat mocked him. 2 years. It had been 2 years since the night in the shipyard. 2 years since Titan, his previous partner, had taken a 9mm round to the chest because Brandon had waited 3 seconds too long to call for backup. He could still hear the sound of Titan's final, whimpering breath. He could still feel the phantom weight of the dog's body in his arms as he ran toward a hospital that was too far away. Not again, Brandon thought, his breathing coming in ragged, shallow bursts. God, please, not again. He had seen Blaze go down. He had seen the way the fugitive's knife disappeared into the dog's side. The memory was a recurring nightmare playing in real time. Brandon had been the one to pull the fugitive off, his rage nearly blinding him, but the hostage, a 19-year-old girl, had been shaking, pointing at Blaze. The dog hadn't barked. He hadn't whimpered. Simply sat down, looked at Brandon with those soul-piercing brown eyes, and then collapsed into the dust. Brandon pushed the accelerator to the floor. The sirens of the ambulance were a mile ahead of him, a trailing ribbon of blue and red light. He was chasing the only thing he had left in this world. Blaze wasn't just a partner. He was Brandon's redemption. He was the living proof that Brandon could still protect something, that the darkness of the job hadn't consumed everything good. "Hold on, buddy," Brandon whispered, his voice cracking. "I'm right here. Don't you leave me in the dark." The ambulance skidded to a halt under the glowing overhang of the Riverside Veterinary Trauma Center at 4:06 a.m. The automatic doors hissed open and the night air, cold and damp, rushed in to meet the heat of the trauma. Sophie and a team of orderlies blurred into motion, swinging the stretcher out. Blaze was a heavy, lifeless weight. The white sheet covering the gurney was already saturated, a morbid map of the dog's failing life. "Get him to table 3. Now." The voice belonged to Dr. Marcus Hale. At 55, Hale was a man who moved with a surgical, cold efficiency. He had spent 20 years in emergency veterinary medicine, and his eyes, sharp and weary behind silver-rimmed glasses, had a way of cataloging trauma before the patient even hit the table. "Canine male 4 years old," Sophie shouted, her voice echoing in the sterile hallway. "Stab wound to the medial thigh. Massive hemorrhage. I've got 1 clamp on, but he's gone into hypovolemic shock. I've pushed 2 units of canine-specific plasma in transit." Hale didn't respond. He was already leaning over Blaze, his hands moving with practiced grace. He felt for a femoral pulse on the opposite leg. Nothing. He moved his hand to the chest. A faint, irregular flutter. "He's bradycardic," Hale snapped. "Get the oxygen mask on him. Start a warm saline drip, wide open. We need to get his core temp up or we'll never get the heart to stabilize." The trauma bay was a symphony of controlled chaos. Trays of stainless steel instruments clattered. The hiss of the oxygen tank filled the air. The heart monitor began its rhythmic electronic pulse. Pulse, pulse. Sophie stood back, her hands held out in front of her as if she were still holding the wound closed. She was covered in Blaze's blood. It was on her forearms, her shirt, even a splash on her chin. She looked like she had crawled out of a war zone. "He saved her, Dr. Hale," Sophie whispered, her eyes fixed on Blaze's still face. "He didn't even blink. He just jumped." Hale didn't look up. He was staring at the monitor. The heart rate was dropping. 60 beats per minute. 45, 30. "The internal damage is too extensive," Hale muttered, more to himself than the room. "The blade didn't just hit the artery, it nicked the bone and ricocheted into the pelvic floor. He's bleeding into the abdomen now. I can't get a handle on it without opening him up, and he's too weak for the anesthesia. You have to try. Sophie stepped forward, her voice rising. Hale looked at her then, a flash of profound sadness crossing his face. Sophie, look at the screen. The line on the monitor was beginning to flatten, the peaks and valleys of the EKG becoming shallow hills. Blaze's chest gave one final, shuddering heave. A long, slow exhale escaped his lungs, the death rattle that every medical professional recognizes in their marrow. The monitor shifted. The rhythmic pulsing sound vanished, replaced by a single unwavering high-pitched tone that pierced the room. 4:12 a.m. The silence that followed the flat line was deafening. The nurses stopped moving. The hiss of the oxygen seemed to grow louder in the absence of the dog's heartbeat. Dr. Hale checked the carotid. He waited 5 seconds. 10. He placed his stethoscope over the ribs, listening for any ghost of a vibration. He heard only the silence of a body that had reached its limit. I'm calling it, Hale said softly. He reached out and turned off the monitor, silencing the scream of the flatline. Time of death, 4:12 a.m. Sophie let out a sound, a choked, broken sob that she caught in her hands. She collapsed against the supply cabinet, her knees giving way. She looked at her hands, the blood starting to dry, turning a dark, rust-colored brown. No, she breathed. No, we can't lose him. Not like this. He was supposed to be okay. Hale rested a hand on Blaze's shoulder. The dog's fur was still warm, but the light had completely vanished from his frame. The muscular, powerful animal that had been the terror of Metro City's underworld was now just a collection of bone and fur on a cold metal table. He was a good dog, Sophie, Hale said, his voice a low gravel. The best. Go wash up. I'll prepare the paperwork for the department. Sophie didn't move. She stayed on the floor, her head between her knees, the weight of the night finally crushing her. She thought of Brandon Shaw. She thought of the look on the detective's face when they had loaded Blaze into the rig. It was the look of a man who was watching his last bridge to the world of the living burn to the ground. And then she heard it. The sound of tires screaming to a halt outside. The heavy thud of a car door being thrown open with enough force to dent the frame. Sophie looked up, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. She knew that sound. It was the sound of a man who refused to believe in the concept of too late. The front doors of the clinic didn't just open, they were struck by a hurricane. Brandon Shaw was coming, and he was bringing the ghosts of his past and the fury of his grief with him. Inside the trauma bay, Dr. Hale was already reaching for a white sheet to cover Blaze's face. Wait, Sophie whispered, standing up unsteadily. Wait, Dr. Hale. Don't cover him yet. Sophie, he's gone, Hale said gently. You don't understand, she said, looking toward the hallway where the sound of heavy, rapid footsteps was growing louder. The man coming through those doors, he doesn't know how to say goodbye. At that moment, the trauma bay doors flew open and Brandon Shaw stood there, bloody, broken, and breathing like a wounded animal. His eyes locked onto the motionless form of his partner, and the air in the room seemed to vanish instantly. The clock on the wall ticked to 4:13 a.m. Blaze had been clinically dead for 60 seconds. In the world of medicine, it was an eternity. In the world of Brandon Shaw, it was just the beginning of the fight. The double doors of the trauma bay didn't just swing open, they shrieked on their hinges as Brandon Shaw collided with them. He didn't look like a man, he looked like a jagged fragment of a riot. His heavy tactical boots skidded on the linoleum, leaving smears of rainwater and warehouse soot behind him. His chest heaved beneath the weight of his Kevlar vest, the ceramic plates rattling with every desperate, panicked breath. To the nurses and Dr. Hale, he looked like a specter of the violence that had claimed Blaze. His face was a map of grease, sweat, and the dried, rust-colored spray of a partner's lifeblood. Brandon froze 3 feet from the table. The silence of the room was more violent than the sirens had been. It was a thick, suffocating vacuum. Under the pitiless glare of the surgical LED arrays, the world was too bright, too sharp, and far too still. There, in the center of the sterile stage, was Blaze. The powerful, 90-pound engine of muscle and instinct was gone. In its place was a collapsed heap of fur. Blaze's head was tilted back, his mouth slightly open, his tongue, once a pink banner of energy, now a pale, cooling gray. The deep, rhythmic thrum of his presence, the literal heartbeat of Brandon's daily life, had been replaced by the electric hum of the overhead lights. Detective Shaw. Dr. Marcus Hale stepped into Brandon's line of sight, his voice pitched in that low, practiced tone of a man who delivered death sentences for a living. Hale's hands were held out, palms up, a gesture of both empathy and a warning not to cross the line into the medical workspace. Detective, I am so sorry. We did everything. The blood loss, the internal damage, it was just too much. Brandon didn't hear him. Not really. The words were just white noise, like the sound of wind through a broken window. His eyes were locked on the monitor. The screen was black. The green line that should have been jumping with life was a flat, horizontal void. Brandon. The voice was small, cracked, and dripping with a guilt that Brandon recognized in his own marrow. He turned his head slowly. Sophie Caldwell was standing by the supply cabinet, her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to disappear into herself. She looked like a casualty. Her paramedic's uniform was soaked through at the chest and arms. Blaze's blood had bonded with the fabric, turning it into a stiff, dark armor. Her eyes were rimmed with a raw, bleeding red, and her hands were still shaking, tucked into her armpits as if she could hide the fact that they had failed to hold onto a soul. I tried, Brandon, she whispered, a fresh tear carving a clean path through the soot on her cheek. I tried so hard. I clamped the artery, I pushed the fluids, but he just drifted away. I'm so sorry. I couldn't hold him. Brandon's throat felt like it was filled with ground glass. He tried to speak, but the air wouldn't come. He took a staggering step forward, his hand reaching out, fingers trembling. As he closed the distance to the table, the sterile scent of the hospital vanished. Suddenly he wasn't at Riverside. The hum of the lights became the distant, rhythmic clanging of metal on metal. The smell of antiseptic became the salt-heavy air of a shipyard at midnight. Titan. The memory hit him like a physical blow. 2 years ago. The rain had been colder then. He could feel the weight of his previous partner, Titan, in his arms. He could feel the way the dog's blood had felt, hot and slick, soaking into his jeans as he ran toward his cruiser. He remembered the whimpering. That terrible high-pitched sound of a hero wondering why it hurt so much to breathe. Brandon had looked into Titan's eyes in those final seconds and promised him he'd be okay. He had lied. Titan had died in the back seat of a Ford Explorer on the way to the vet, his head resting on Brandon's lap while Brandon screamed at traffic that wouldn't move. That failure had become the foundation of Brandon's life, a crushing, invisible silt that filled his lungs every morning when he woke up. He had spent 2 years building a wall of isolation, a fortress of never again, until Blaze had come along and chewed through the gate. Now the wall was gone and the shipyard was back. Brandon reached the table. He laid his hand on Blaze's flank. The fur was still warm, a cruel, lingering heat that mocked the stillness beneath it. He moved his hand up to the dog's neck, his thumb searching for the carotid, for any ghost of a vibration, any secret pulse that the machines were too stupid to find. Nothing. Just the cooling skin of a friend. You saved that girl, Blaze, Brandon whispered, his voice a low, jagged rasp that seemed to vibrate in the very floorboards. You did your job, boy. You went into the fire and you didn't look back. His fingers brushed against Blaze's ear. It flopped over, lifeless. Detective, Dr. Hale said, stepping closer, his hand reaching for the white cotton sheet draped over the end of the table. We need to move him. The department will want to make arrangements for the honors. You shouldn't stay for this part. The word honors triggered something in Brandon's brain. A chemical shift. The grief didn't vanish, it didn't leave, but it crystallized. It turned from a drowning pool into a cold, sharp spear. Honors were for the dead. Honors were the consolation prize for a partner who failed to keep his word. Brandon looked at Blaze's face and for a split second, he saw the face of every child Blaze had found, every officer Blaze had protected, and the face of the young woman at the warehouse who was breathing right now only because this dog had chosen to bleed. Brandon's hand stopped trembling. His posture shifted. The slumped, defeated detective vanished, replaced by a man who looked like he was about to step into a breach. No, Brandon said. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a shout. It was a command, the kind used on AK-9 that had broken a stay. Detective. Hale paused, the sheet halfway to Blaze's face. Brandon turned his head, and both Hale and Sophie recoiled. The raw, weeping pain in his eyes had been replaced by a fierce, terrifying determination. It was the look of a man who had stared into the abyss and decided he didn't like the view. Everyone, Brandon said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a resonant, commanding baritone. Step back. Right now. I need space around the table. Brandon, what are you doing? Sophie asked, her voice trembling with a mix of confusion and fear. She stepped forward, her hand reaching out as if to steady him. He's gone. The time of death was minutes ago. You're in shock, you need to. I said step back. Brandon barked. The authority in his voice was absolute. Even Dr. Hale, a man who reigned over this trauma bay with unquestioned seniority, retreated 2 steps. Brandon wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a man operating on a frequency no one else in the room could hear. Brandon reached for the Velcro straps of his tactical vest. The sound of the fasteners ripping apart echoed like a series of small explosions in the quiet room. He yanked the heavy gear off, letting it hit the floor with a dull, metallic thud. Next came his uniform jacket. He threw it onto a nearby chair, revealing a black compression shirt soaked in sweat. "Detective Shaw, I cannot allow you to interfere with," Hale started, his professional hackles finally rising. "There's always something more, Doctor," Brandon interrupted, his eyes never leaving Blaze. He began to roll up his sleeves, his forearms corded with muscle and scarred from years of street work. "You look at him and you see a medical failure. You see a clock that ran out. I see a partner who hasn't been given his fair shake yet." "Brandon, please," Sophie whispered, her heart breaking for him. She thought he had finally snapped. "Don't do this to yourself. Don't make it harder." "I'm not doing this for me, Sophie," Brandon said. He stepped into the V of Blaze's front legs, positioning himself at the dog's head and chest. "I'm doing this for him." He looked down at Blaze. He remembered the basement in the cobble safe house. He remembered the grizzled Delta Force medic, a man who lived in the gray space between life and death, showing him a technique that the military brass refused to acknowledge. "The body is just a machine, Shaw," the medic had told him, his hands moving with impossible speed over a dying K9. "Sometimes the engine stalls, and standard CPR is like trying to jumpstart a tank with a flashlight battery. You have to trigger the cascade. You have to force the nervous system to reboot the heart." Brandon had seen it work once. He had seen a dog that had been dead for 10 minutes stand up and walk 24 hours later. It was reckless. It was unproven. It was a pressure cascade. Brandon placed his right hand firmly over Blaze's sternum, but he didn't push. Instead, his left hand moved to the base of the dog's skull, his thumb and forefinger finding the precise neural clusters behind the ears. "What is that?" Dr. Hale asked, his medical curiosity momentarily overriding his anger. He leaned in, his eyes narrowed behind his glasses. "That's not a resuscitation position. You're going to cause postmortem trauma to the cervical spine." "Watch," Brandon whispered. He closed his eyes for a second, visualizing the map of Blaze's nervous system. He needed to be precise. If he was too hard, he'd shatter the ribs. If he was too soft, he was just massaging a ghost. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked, her voice a frantic, desperate tether to reality. Brandon didn't answer. He took a deep, centering breath, exhaling the last of his doubt. "I'm bringing him back," Brandon said. As he began the first rhythmic, terrifyingly intense compression, a movement that combined a sharp thrust to the chest with a precise, vibratory pressure to the brainstem, the room seemed to tilt. Sophie watched, her breath caught in her throat, her mind screaming that this was impossible, that this was madness. But as Brandon's hands moved with a cold, mechanical precision, she saw something she hadn't seen in 2 years. She saw Brandon Shaw stop being a man haunted by the past, and start being a man who was going to rewrite the future. The first minute of the miracle began in total, crushing silence, broken only by the rhythmic thud snap of Brandon's hands against his partner's chest. The trauma bay at Riverside was no longer a room of medicine. It had become a theater of the impossible. Brandon Shaw stood over the metal table, his shadow cast long and jagged against the far wall by the overhead surgical lights. He didn't look like a grieving owner anymore. He looked like a man possessed by a singular, violent purpose. He had positioned his hands in a way that made Dr. Hale's skin crawl. Instead of the standard palm-over-palm compression used in canine CPR, the rhythmic 2-inch deep thrusts meant to manually pump a stalled heart, Brandon's left hand was hooked like a claw around the base of Blaze's throat, his thumb pressing into the soft tissue just above the manubrium. His right hand wasn't on the ribs, it was slammed flat against the sternum, but his fingers were splayed, digging into the intercostal spaces between the dog's ribs. "Detective, stop," Dr. Hale said, his voice rising with a mix of professional alarm and genuine horror. "That is not proper canine resuscitation protocol. You're not compressing the ventricles, you're putting pressure on the carotid sinus and the vagus nerve. You're going to cause a massive tracheal collapse or a neural surge that will—" "It's not meant to be protocol, doctor," Brandon interrupted, his voice a low, vibrating growl that didn't even sound like his own. He didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the point where his right hand met Blaze's chest. "Protocol is for when you have time. Protocol is for when the heart is still willing to listen. Blaze is past protocol." Sophie Caldwell stood frozen by the crash cart, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She wiped a smudge of drying blood from her cheek with the back of her hand, her eyes wide. "Brandon, what is that? What are you doing to him?" Brandon didn't answer immediately. He began the motion. It wasn't a pump, it was a cascade. He delivered a sharp, vibratory strike to the sternum, a precordial thump, taken to a lethal extreme, and immediately followed it with a rhythmic rolling pressure that traveled from the dog's throat down to his midsection. He was using his body weight not to crush, but to create a wave of pressure. Thud, roll, pulse, thud, roll, pulse. As he worked, Brandon's mind retreated. The sterile walls of Riverside dissolved into the shimmering, oppressive heat of a desert hangar in the Middle East. 2 years ago. Joint Military K-9 Training Annex 2 o'clock hours. The air had tasted like JP-8 jet fuel and pulverized limestone. Brandon had been part of a classified exchange program, embedded with an elite multi-purpose K-9 unit. They were the shadows who went in before the SEALs, the dogs who smelled the copper of a trigger wire before a human could even see the door. The instructor was a man known only as Master Sergeant Thorne, a medic whose face was a topographic map of scars and whose hands had rebuilt more broken bodies than most city hospitals. They were standing over a dummy, a weighted canine anatomical model, in the dim light of a kerosene lamp. "Standard medicine is a luxury of the paved world, Shaw," Thorne had said, his voice like grinding gravel. "Out here, when a dog's heart stops from trauma, you don't have a crash cart. You don't have a defibrillator. You have your hands and the nervous system. The body is a series of electrical circuits. When the main breaker flips, you don't just keep hitting the switch. You have to bypass the wiring. You have to create a pressure cascade." Thorne had demonstrated the technique, a combination of tactical combat medicine and experimental neurostimulation. It was a reboot of the autonomic system. By applying specific high-intensity pressure to the vagal nerve clusters while simultaneously forcing a blood pressure spike through the thoracic cavity, you could, in theory, trigger a cascade of electrical activity that forced the sinoatrial node to fire. "It's never been approved by the board," Thorne warned, his eyes dark. "It's too risky. You can snap the neck. You can cause a brain bleed. Most vets would call it witchcraft or assault. But when the clock hits 0 and the dog is already dead, you aren't risking his life anymore. You're stealing it back from the dark." Brandon had seen Thorne use it once. A Belgian Malinois named Jax had taken the brunt of an IED. The dog had been flatlined for nearly 9 minutes. The team had been ready to call it. Thorne hadn't. He had performed the cascade for 12 minutes straight until his own hands were bleeding. On the 13th minute, the dog had gasped. Brandon had never forgotten the sound of that gasp. It sounded like the world being put back together. Riverside Veterinary Trauma Center. 4:18 a.m. "He's been dead for 6 minutes, Detective," Dr. Hale shouted, his hand hovering over Brandon's shoulder, hesitating to touch the man for fear of what might happen. "The biological clock is ticking. Even if, by some miracle, that heart starts beating, the oxygen deprivation to the cerebral cortex is absolute. You're reviving a body with no mind left. You're causing him more pain." "He's not in pain," Brandon snapped, his teeth clenched so hard they felt like they might shatter. "He's waiting for me." Brandon's breathing had changed. It was no longer the panicked panting of a man in shock. It had become deep, guttural, and perfectly synchronized with his hand movements. Inhale, strike, still, roll. It was meditative, a violent sort of prayer. Every muscle in his back was corded, his shirt soaked through with a fresh layer of sweat that mingled with the soot on his skin. Sophie watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She saw the way Brandon was looking at Blaze. It wasn't the look of a man saying goodbye. It was the look of a man reaching into a deep, dark well, refusing to let go of a hand that was slipping away. "Look at his hands," one of the nurses whispered, leaning in. "He's hitting the nerve clusters. I've seen some experimental neuro stuff in textbooks, but nothing this physical." Hale checked his watch again. The second hand seemed to be moving with a cruel, mocking speed. 7 minutes. "Brandon, please. Think about the dog. Think about Blaze's dignity." "Blaze doesn't give a damn about dignity," Brandon hissed. "He cares about the mission. And the mission isn't over." The room grew colder, the silence of the flatline monitor a constant, invisible weight. The initial adrenaline of Brandon's arrival was fading, replaced by the grim, heavy reality of the passage of time. 7.5 minutes. Most medical journals cited 4 to 5 minutes as the threshold for permanent, irreversible brain damage in canines. At 8 minutes the cells began to liquefy. "Brandon," Sophie said, her voice a fragile thread. She stepped closer, her hand finally reaching out to touch his arm. Brandon, maybe it's time to. Maybe we should let him go. You saved him once. You gave him a great life. Don't let his last memory be this. Brandon didn't flinch. He didn't even acknowledge her touch. He was staring into Blaze's eyes, the clouded, fixed, and dilated pupils of a corpse. Come on, Blaze, Brandon thought, the words a silent scream in the cathedral of his mind. Don't you leave me. Not after Titan. I can't do this a third time. I can't walk back into that house alone. You're the only one who knows the truth. You're the only one who doesn't look at me like I'm broken. Focus on my voice. Follow the pressure. Break the wall, damn you. 8 minutes. The air in the trauma bay felt stagnant, the scent of blood and ozone thick enough to taste. Dr. Hale shook his head and turned away, reaching for a clipboard to finalize the declaration he had already made. The nurses lowered their heads. The miracle was failing. Brandon was just a man beating on a piece of meat. I'm sorry, Brandon, Sophie whispered, a sob breaking through her voice. She started to pull him away, her grip tightening on his bicep. He's gone. He's really... Suddenly Brandon stopped. He froze, his hands still pressed deep into Blaze's chest and throat. His head was tilted, his eyes narrowed as if he were listening to a sound a mile away. Brandon? Sophie asked, her breath hitching. Quiet, Brandon commanded. For 3 seconds the room was a tomb. And then it happened. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor rippled through Blaze's chest. It wasn't a heartbeat, not yet, but a spasm, a violent twitch of the diaphragm that sent a shudder through the dog's entire frame. Dr. Hale spun around, his jaw dropping. What was that? A post-mortem reflex. No, Brandon breathed, his eyes igniting with a terrifying light. That was the breaker flipping. He didn't wait. He doubled his efforts, his hands moving with a new, frantic energy. He delivered 3 rapid, precise strikes to the sternum, his voice a low command. Breathe, Blaze. Breathe. Another tremor. This one was stronger. Blaze's tail, which had been a lifeless weight, twitched once against the metal table. A sound, a tiny, wet, clicking noise, emerged from the dog's throat. Sophie gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Oh my God, did he just... The monitor. Dr. Hale screamed, diving for the EKG leads he had discarded. Get the leads back on him. Now. Move. The nurses scrambled, their professional stoicism shattered by the impossible. They clipped the sensors back onto Blaze's paws with trembling fingers. For a heartbeat, the screen remained black. And then a single jagged green spike climbed out of the basement of the display. Beep. A second passed. A lifetime. Beep. The line didn't flatline. It dipped, then rose again. It was weak, irregular, and shallow, but it was there. A rhythm. A heartbeat. He's got a pulse, a nurse shouted, her voice bordering on hysteria. We have a pulse. Sinus bradycardia, but it's holding. Sophie collapsed against Brandon's side, her face buried in his shoulder, weeping with a combination of relief and pure, unadulterated shock. Brandon didn't move. He didn't celebrate. He kept his hands on Blaze, his head bowed, his own heart finally slowing down to match the struggling rhythm of his partner. 8 minutes, Dr. Hale whispered, staring at his watch as if it had betrayed him. 8 minutes and 12 seconds. It's impossible. He looked at Brandon Shaw, the man who had just reached into the afterlife and dragged a soul back by its collar. Blaze's chest rose. It was a shallow, shuddering breath, followed by a long, wet wheeze, but the dog was breathing. The pressure cascade had worked. The miracle had arrived at 4:20 a.m., but as Brandon looked at the monitor, he knew the easy part was over. They had cheated death, but death was a creditor that always came to collect. The silence that followed the first tremor was more expectant than the silence of death had been. It was a vacuum waiting to be filled with something impossible. Sophie Caldwell's eyes were fixed on Blaze's flank, the area just behind the last rib where the skin had been as still as carved stone for more than 8 minutes. She saw it again. A minute, fluttering ripple, like a stone skipped across the surface of a dark pond. It was so small that in the harsh, flickering fluorescence of the trauma bay, it could have been a trick of the light, a hallucination born of a desperate mind. Wait. Sophie's voice was a sharp, jagged gasp that cut through the room. Wait. Did you see that? Dr. Hale, look. Dr. Marcus Hale didn't wait for a second invitation. The cynicism of 30 years in the field, the hard-earned knowledge that death was a one-way door, was momentarily swept aside by the sheer, primal urgency in Sophie's voice. He lunged forward, his stethoscope already gripped in his hand. He didn't go for the traditional chest placement. He followed Brandon's hands, sliding the cold diaphragm of the instrument into the narrow gap Brandon had created between his palms. For 3 beats of the wall clock, Hale was as still as a statue. His eyes were closed, his head tilted, every ounce of his being focused on the tiny vibrations traveling through the tubing into his ears. Then his eyes flew open. They weren't just wide, they were haunted. "He has a rhythm," Hale whispered, the words sounding like a confession. "It's chaotic, it's thready, but it's there." Beep. The sound came from the monitor. It was a single, lonely electronic chirp that seemed to echo off every stainless steel surface in the room. The nurses, who had been standing like mourners at a funeral, suddenly jolted as if they had been hit with a live wire. Beep. Beep. The jagged green spike on the screen was no longer a ghost. It was a heartbeat, weak, struggling, and rhythmic. It was the sound of an engine catching after a long, frozen winter. "How?" one of the nurses whispered, her voice trembling. "He was cold. We called it. How is that possible?" The staff erupted into a low, frantic murmur of disbelief, but Brandon Shaw didn't join them. He didn't look at the monitor. He didn't look at Dr. Hale. He didn't even seem to hear the voices. He was locked into a private world where only he and Blaze existed. Brandon didn't celebrate. He didn't pull back. If anything, he leaned harder into the dog, his jaw so tight that a vein in his temple looked ready to burst. He knew the pressure cascade wasn't finished. The heart was a fickle muscle. It could stop again just as easily as it had started if the neural pathways weren't fully engaged. He continued the technique, his hands moving with a rhythmic, bruising intensity. Strike, roll, pulse. He was sweating so profusely now that droplets were falling from his chin, spotting the white surgical sheet. His arms were shaking with the effort of maintaining the exact frequency Master Sergeant Thorne had taught him in the desert. The frequency of life. "Brandon, stop, you're going to break him." Sophie cried out, though her tears were now of a different kind, hot, messy, and overflowing with a hope that felt dangerous. "Not yet," Brandon ground out through clenched teeth. "I have to lock it in. Come on, Blaze. Fight for it. Fight for me." And then, the most beautiful sound Sophie had ever heard filled the room. It was a wet, rattling gasp. Blaze's chest heaved, a massive, involuntary contraction of the diaphragm that sent a shudder through his entire 75-pound frame. His ribcage expanded with a violent suddenness, drawing in a lungful of oxygenated air for the first time in nearly 10 minutes. "He's breathing," Sophie whispered, covering her mouth with her blood-stained hands, her knees finally giving out. She slumped against the side of the table, her eyes never leaving the dog's face. "Oh my God, Brandon, he's breathing." Blaze's chest rose and fell in a shallow, shuddering cadence. Each breath was a struggle, a labored wheeze that sounded like air being forced through a narrow pipe, but it was autonomous. The machine had been jump-started. Dr. Hale was moving now, his professional instincts overriding his shock. He was checking the dog's pupils, his hands moving with a frantic speed as he tried to catch up to the miracle Brandon had forced into existence. "The pupils are reacting," Hale announced, his voice thick with a bewildered awe. "They're constricting. There's neural activity. Detective, I've been a surgeon for half my life. I have seen things I thought were impossible, but I have never, ever seen anything like this." He looked at Brandon, his brow furrowed in a mix of respect and deep, unsettled concern. "What did you just do? That wasn't medicine. What was that?" Brandon finally pulled his hands back. He stood up straight, his spine popping with the release of tension. He looked like a man who had just spent 10 rounds in a heavyweight fight. His face was gray, his eyes hollowed out, and he had to grip the edge of the metal table to keep from toppling over. "Something I swore I'd never have to use again," Brandon rasped. His voice was nearly gone, reduced to a dry, papery whisper. He looked down at Blaze. The dog's eyes, the deep, intelligent brown eyes that Brandon knew better than his own reflection, fluttered. They didn't fully open, just a sliver of dark iris appearing beneath the lids, unfocused and glazed, before sliding shut again. Brandon leaned close, his forehead almost touching the dog's velvet ear. "That's it, boy. Stay with me. You're not done yet. You hear me? The mission isn't over. Stay in the light." The room, which had been attuned just minutes ago, suddenly transformed into a hive of high-intensity medical activity. "I need 2 liters of warm Ringer's lactate," Hale shouted, the shock finally hardening back into the authoritative tone of a lead surgeon. "Get the internal warming blanket on him. We need to push the epinephrine but titrate it. We don't want to blow that heart out now that it's finally ticking. Get the oxygen mask secured. Move." The nurses swarmed. 4 lines were flushed, monitors were recalibrated, and the frantic rhythmic sounds of a trauma team in high gear filled the air. They were no longer preparing a body for the morgue, they were fighting to keep a survivor alive. Sophie stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She moved toward Brandon, who had retreated into the corner of the room to stay out of the nurse's way. He was leaning against the wall, his hands tucked under his armpits. She reached out and touched his arm. He was vibrating. A fine high-frequency tremor was running through his entire body, the inevitable crash of a massive adrenaline dump. "Brandon," she said softly, "you brought him back. You actually brought him back." Brandon looked at her, but it was as if he were looking through her, seeing something miles away. He looked at his hands, which were now visibly shaking. "I almost lost him," he whispered. "I was in the shipyard again, Sophie. I could feel Titan's blood on my hands. I could hear the silence. I almost let it happen again." "But you didn't," Sophie said firmly, her hand tightening on his arm, grounding him. "Whatever you did, whatever that was, it worked. He's here. Look at the monitor, Brandon. Look at the numbers." The heart rate was climbing, stabilizing at a steady 55 beats per minute. The oxygen saturation, which had been 0, was beginning its slow, agonizing climb into the 70s. Blaze was still in critical condition. He was still a dog with a massive hole in his side and a brain that had been deprived of air for far too long, but he was alive. Brandon closed his eyes and let out a long, ragged breath that sounded like a sob he wouldn't allow himself to fully release. He leaned his head back against the cold tile of the wall and just stood there, a broken hero in a room full of machines. Dr. Hale stepped away from the table after a few minutes, leaving the nurses to finish the stabilization. He wiped his brow with the back of his sleeve and approached Brandon. His expression was no longer one of shock. It had shifted into something more complicated, a mixture of professional curiosity, wariness, and the dawning realization of the paperwork that was about to follow. "He's stable for the moment," Hale said, his voice low. "We're moving him to the ICU for 24-hour observation. We need to run a full neurological workup as soon as he's strong enough. The fact that he's breathing on his own it's a statistical anomaly of the highest order." Hale paused, looking Brandon dead in the eye. "But Detective Shaw, we need to talk about what just happened in this room. You performed a procedure that is not recognized by any veterinary board in the country. You overrode a declared time of death. From a legal and medical standpoint, what happened tonight it's a minefield." Brandon opened his eyes. The exhaustion was there, but so was the iron. "He's breathing, doctor. That's the only standpoint I care about." "I understand that," Hale said, his voice dropping even lower. "And believe me, as a man who loves animals, I am in awe. But as the head of this facility, I have to report this. The department will be asking questions. Internal Affairs will be asking questions. You didn't just save a dog tonight, Brandon. You broke every rule we have." Brandon didn't flinch. He looked past Hale at the stretcher they were now using to move Blaze toward the intensive care unit. The dog's tail gave a tiny, involuntary twitch as they wheeled him past. "Let them ask," Brandon said, his voice regaining its steel. "Blaze is the only one I have to answer to. And right now he's still here." Sophie watched the exchange, her heart sinking even as it soared. She looked at Brandon, this man who had quite literally cheated the Reaper, and realized that the miracle was only the beginning. The world didn't like it when you broke the rules, even if you did it to save a hero. The storm outside continued to rage, the rain lashing against the windows of the trauma center, but inside, for the first time in hours, there was a flicker of light in the dark. The story of the Midnight Miracle didn't just spread, it mutated. In the 36 hours following Blaze's revival, the digital grapevine of the Metro City Police Department had turned Brandon Shaw into something between a local legend and a secular saint. It started with a frantic dispatch log, moved to hushed whispers in the precinct locker rooms, and finally exploded across private law enforcement forums. By the second morning, every K-9 handler from the coast to the valley had heard a version of the tale. They called it the Lazarus Protocol. They whispered that Shaw had some kind of specialized military touch, a way of command that even death had to obey. But inside the walls of the Riverside Veterinary Trauma Center, the atmosphere was far from celebratory. Brandon hadn't left the hospital. He sat in the dimmed light of the ICU, his chair pulled so close to Blaze's recovery crate that their knees, one human, one canine, were nearly touching. Blaze was a ghost of his former self, hooked to a labyrinth of tubes and a steady hiss of oxygen, his breathing mechanical and shallow. Every few hours, the dog's paws would twitch in his drug-induced sleep, and Brandon would reach out a steadying hand, his thumb stroking the velvet fur of Blaze's ear. He was exhausted, his eyes rimmed with the kind of deep, bruised shadows that sleep couldn't fix. He felt as though he had left a piece of his own soul back on that trauma table at 4:12 a.m., traded away to bring Blaze back. "You need to eat something, Brandon." Sophie Caldwell stood in the doorway, holding 2 cardboard cups of lukewarm cafeteria coffee. She had changed into fresh scrubs, but the memory of the blood on her hands seemed to linger in the way she moved, cautiously as if the world were made of glass. Brandon didn't look up. "He shifted his head 5 minutes ago, Sophie. Dr. Hale says it's just a reflexive response to the sedatives, but I felt him. He's in there." "I know he is," Sophie said softly, stepping into the room and handing him a cup. "But you won't be much use to him if you collapse from a heart attack. You've been running on adrenaline and spite for 2 days. Brandon finally took the coffee, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was brief, but it was the only thing that felt solid in a world that had become surreal. The department called. They want a full report on the procedure. Internal Affairs is already sniffing around, asking Hale for the medical logs. "Let them sniff," Sophie said, though her brow furrowed. They weren't there. They didn't see the flat line. The conversation was interrupted by the sudden, discordant wail of a siren, not the distant, city-wide moan they were used to, but a sharp, urgent shriek that died right outside the hospital's main bay. Brandon stood instinctively, his hand dropping to the phantom weight of the holster he wasn't wearing. Through the glass of the ICU, he saw the strobe of blue and red lights reflecting off the wet pavement. This wasn't a standard transport. This was a high-speed arrival. A moment later, the hallway erupted in chaos. Sergeant Rita Coleman burst through the double doors. She was a 20-year veteran from the East Side Precinct, a woman known for a constitution made of iron and a heart that she kept under lock and key. But the woman Brandon saw now was unrecognizable. Her uniform was torn at the shoulder, her face pale and streaked with road grime. Behind her, 2 officers were carrying a stretcher. On it lay Duke, a massive black and tan German shepherd whose presence usually commanded the room. Now Duke was a broken ruin. His breathing was a wet, clicking sound, and his hindquarters were positioned at an unnatural angle. "Where is he?" Rita screamed, her eyes wild, scanning the lobby until they landed on Brandon. "Where is Shaw?" Brandon stepped out of the ICU, Sophie right behind him. Dr. Hale was already there, his face tightening as he saw the state of the new patient. "Rita, what happened?" Brandon asked, stepping forward to catch her as she nearly stumbled. "A pursuit," Rita gasped, her voice breaking. He jumped out to intercept the suspect's vehicle. The driver didn't swerve, Brandon. He didn't swerve. Duke took the hit at 40 miles per hour. They said his heart stopped in the rig. They said he's gone. The officers set the stretcher down on the central intake table. Duke's chest was still, his eyes fixed and staring. The smell of burnt rubber and hot asphalt clung to his fur, the scent of a violent, mechanical end. "Get him into Bay 2. Hale commanded, but Rita didn't look at the doctor. She grabbed the front of Brandon's shirt with both hands, her knuckles white. "I heard what you did," she sobbed, her face inches from his. "I heard about Blaze. They said you brought him back. They said you have a way. Please, Brandon. He's all I have. He's my partner. Please, do it for Duke. Save mine too." The weight of the words hit Brandon like a physical blow. "Save mine too." He looked at Duke. He didn't see a case. He saw the expectation of a miracle. He saw the impossible burden of the legend that had grown around him in the last 36 hours. "Rita," Brandon said, his voice low and pained. "Blaze's situation was different. It was a puncture wound. Blood loss. I don't care." Rita shrieked, the sound echoing off the sterile tiles. "You did it. You have the technique. Don't you dare tell me you won't try. Don't you dare let him die because you're tired." Dr. Hale moved in, his hands already performing a rapid, grim assessment of Duke. He pulled Brandon aside, his voice a sharp, urgent whisper. "Brandon, look at the injuries. This isn't just a heart that stopped. This is blunt force trauma. There are ruptured organs, likely a shattered pelvis, and massive internal hemorrhaging. Your technique? The pressure cascade? It's designed to reboot the neural pathways and the cardiac rhythm. It's for a stalled engine. It cannot fix mechanical destruction. You'll just be crushing his ribs." "I know," Brandon whispered, looking back at Rita. She had collapsed into a chair, her head in her hands, her body shaking with the force of her grief. He knew the science. He knew the limits of the human, and canine, frame. But he also knew the look in Rita's eyes. It was the same look he had seen in the mirror every morning for 2 years after Titan died. It was the look of a person who was about to be abandoned in the dark. "Put him on the table," Brandon said. Sophie gasped. "Brandon, you're exhausted. You haven't slept, you?" "I said put him on the table." Brandon stripped off his sweater, revealing the same black compression shirt from 2 nights ago. His muscles ached, his joints felt like they were filled with sand, and his hands were already beginning to tremble. But the pressure of the room, the pressure of the miracle, was a tide he couldn't swim against. The staff moved with a grim, mechanical efficiency. Duke was transferred to the metal table. The heart monitor was hooked up. The flatline was immediate, the high-pitched drone of the EKG a haunting reprise of Blaze's death. "Time of arrest, 11:14 p.m., a nurse announced. Brandon stepped into the same position he had occupied 36 hours prior. He placed his hands on Duke's chest. But the moment he touched the dog, he felt the difference. Blaze had felt like a machine that had simply run out of fuel, still intact, still whole. Duke felt like a bag of broken glass. Beneath the fur, Brandon could feel the jagged edges of shattered ribs and the terrifying softness of internal collapse. "Brandon," Sophie whispered, standing by his side, her hand hovering near his back. "Think about what you're doing." "Shut up, Sophie," he hissed, but there was no venom in it, only a desperate, suffocating fear. He began. Strike. Roll. Pulse. The rhythm was the same, but the sound was different. Instead of the solid thud of a healthy chest, there was a sickening, wet crepitus. Brandon's thumbs pressed into the neural clusters at the base of the skull, searching for the spark, searching for the breaker Master Sergeant Thorne had spoken of. 2 minutes passed. Brandon's breathing became a series of ragged, desperate grunts. He was pushing harder than he had with Blaze, trying to compensate for the damage with sheer physical will. Sweat poured off his forehead, stinging his eyes, but he didn't blink. "The monitor is still flat, Detective," Dr. Hale said, his voice devoid of judgment, filled only with a quiet, clinical sadness. "I'm not stopping," Brandon roared. 5 minutes. Rita stood in the corner, her hands clasped as if in prayer, her eyes fixed on Duke's face. "Come on, Duke. Come on, baby. Listen to him. Listen to Brandon." Brandon's hands were starting to cramp. The pressure cascade required a precise, vibratory frequency, but his muscles were screaming in protest. He felt a rib give way under his palm, a sickening pop that made everyone in the room flinch. "Brandon, stop," Sophie said, her voice stronger now, more certain. She reached out and grabbed his shoulder. "You're hurting him. He's gone, Brandon. He's been gone since the impact. He's not gone until I say he's gone." Brandon's eyes were bloodshot, his face a mask of sweating, frantic denial. He shifted his weight, putting his entire soul into the next compression. "Breathe, damn you. Duke, breathe." 7 minutes. The room was silent except for the sound of Brandon's struggling breath and the mechanical hum of the lights. The miracle was nowhere to be found. The air felt heavy, stagnant, as if the hospital itself were rejecting the attempt. "Brandon," Dr. Hale said, stepping forward and placing a firm hand on Brandon's wrist, physically stopping the next strike. "It's been 10 minutes since the accident. The internal trauma is too great. You're trying to jumpstart a heart that has nothing left to pump. Look at the monitor. Look at the dog." Brandon stopped. His hands remained on Duke's chest, but the movement had died. He looked down at the dog. Duke's eyes were still staring, fixed and dilated, reflecting the cold, blue light of the bay. There was no tremor. No twitch of the tail. No breaker flipping in the dark. Duke was dead. Truly, finally, irrevocably dead. Brandon stepped back, his arms dropping to his sides. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The adrenaline that had sustained him for 2 days vanished in a single, crushing instant, leaving only the cold, hard reality of the limit. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a miracle worker. He was just a man with a technique that had worked once by the grace of God and 1,000 variables he couldn't control. Rita Coleman walked slowly to the table. She looked at Duke, then she looked at Brandon. The hope that had lit her face minutes ago didn't just fade, it curdled. It turned into a bitter, jagged resentment that cut through the room like a blade. "You saved yours," she whispered, the words trembling with a raw, agonizing venom. "Rita, I tried," Brandon started, his voice cracking. "You saved yours," she screamed, her voice hitting a register of pure, unadulterated pain. She lunged forward, not to hug him, but to shove him back against the wall. "You brought Blaze back. Everyone said you were a hero. Why couldn't you save mine? Why was he good enough and Duke wasn't? What did you do different?" "I didn't do anything different, Rita," Brandon said, his back against the cold tile, his head dropping. The injuries, they were too much. I'm just a man. No. Rita sobbed, collapsing over Duke's body, her fingers tangling in his dark fur. You gave me hope. You let me believe, and now he's still dead. You should have just let me say goodbye. You should have just let him go. Sophie moved to Brandon's side, her hand found his, her fingers interlacing with his trembling ones. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Brandon looked at the monitor. The flat line was a straight, uncompromising horizon. He had learned the most dangerous lesson of all. A miracle is a debt that you can never truly repay. And as the news of Duke's death began to filter through the same grapevine that had exalted him, Brandon knew the backlash would be just as swift as the praise. He had played God and the bill had finally come due. The transition from the blood-slicked floors of the trauma bay to the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways of Metro City Police Headquarters felt like a descent into a different kind of purgatory. In the trauma center, life and death were raw, visceral, and immediate. In the halls of power, life and death were reduced to line items, liability waivers, and the cold, unyielding weight of administrative protocol. The midnight miracle had lasted less than 48 hours before the narrative began to sour. By the time the sun rose on the third day, the local news cycle had already pivoted. The headline on the Metro City Gazette's digital front page was no longer about the heroic revival of AK-9. It had been replaced by a more salacious, biting inquiry: hero or hazard? Detectives, miracle, under investigation. Below the fold, the story of Duke's death had been leaked, likely by a disgruntled officer from the East Side precinct who hadn't seen the cascade, but had seen the weeping, shattered Sergeant Coleman. The public, always hungry for a fallen idol, began to chew on the bones of Brandon's reputation. Social media was a battlefield of opinions. Half the city hailed him as a pioneer, while the other half, spurred by professional veterinary associations, called for his badge, claiming he was practicing medicine without a license and performing voodoo science on helpless animals. Brandon didn't read the articles. He didn't have to. He felt the shift in the air the moment he stepped into the 4th precinct. The usual nods of respect from his colleagues were replaced by averted eyes and hushed conversations that died the moment he walked past. The disciplinary hearing was held in room 412, a windowless box that smelled of stale coffee and ozone. A long mahogany table separated Brandon from a 3-person panel that held his career in their hands. At the center sat Captain Linda Morales, a woman whose career was built on an unwavering adherence to the chain of command. To her left was Agent Miller from Internal Affairs, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from a block of gray ice. To her right sat a representative from the city's legal counsel, already leafing through a stack of liability forms. Detective Shaw, Morales began, her voice echoing in the small room. She didn't look at him, she looked at the file in front of her. We are here to review the events of the last 48 hours. Specifically, your unauthorized use of an unverified, potentially dangerous medical procedure on 2 separate occasions. Brandon sat in the hard plastic chair, his back straight, his hands folded on the table. He was wearing his dress blues, the medals on his chest feeling like lead weights. He hadn't slept in nearly 60 hours. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a persistent, dull ache in the marrow of his bones. Captain, Brandon said, his voice a low, steady rasp. Blaze was dead. Dr. Hale had called the time of death. Standard protocols had failed. I didn't interfere with a medical procedure. I provided one when there were no other options. Procedure? You aren't licensed to perform, Brandon, Morales countered, finally looking up. Her eyes were not unkind, but they were firm. You are a detective, not a veterinarian. You performed a technique that is not recognized by the American Veterinary Medical Association. You took a gamble with a department asset. Blaze is not an asset, Captain, Brandon snapped, the iron in his voice returning. He is my partner. And he is breathing right now because I took that gamble. Agent Miller leaned forward, his hands interlaced. And what about Duke, Detective? Sergeant Coleman's K-9? You performed the same technique on him. And yet, Duke remains dead. Sergeant Coleman claims you gave her false hope. She claims you turned her partner's final moments into a grotesque experiment. The words felt like a physical strike. Brandon's jaw tightened until it throbbed. Duke's injuries were mechanical. Ruptured organs, internal hemorrhage. The cascade is designed for neural and cardiac reboot, not to repair a shattered body. I told Rita it was different. I told her the odds were 0. Then why do it? Miller asked, his voice oily with accusation. Why play God if you knew it wouldn't work? Was it for the cameras? Or are you so addicted to the miracle worker label that you've lost sight of reality? Your technique is inconsistent, undocumented, and, according to the experts we've consulted, highly dangerous to the animal's spinal integrity. I did it because she asked, Brandon said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I did it because I know what it's like to stand over a partner and have nothing but empty hands. I did it because I refused to let her wonder, what if, for the rest of her life. The door opened and Dr. Marcus Hale was called in to testify. He looked uncomfortable in his tweed blazer, his silver-rimmed glasses sliding down his nose as he took his seat. Dr. Hale, Morales said, in your professional opinion, did Detective Shaw's actions contribute to the revival of K9 Blaze? Hale hesitated, looking at Brandon for a long, silent moment. Medically, I cannot explain it. By every metric we use in veterinary science, Blaze was deceased. His heart had stopped for over 8 minutes. Detective Shaw's actions were extraordinary, yes, but they were also reckless. He bypassed every standard of care. While the result was miraculous, I cannot medically verify the technique. It is an outlier. A fluke. And Duke? Miller asked. Hale shook his head. As I told the detective at the time, Duke was beyond saving. The technique was futile. In that instance, it served only to delay the inevitable and cause further distress to the handler. Next was Sophie Caldwell. She marched into the room with her chin up, her paramedic uniform pressed and crisp. She didn't look at the panel, she looked only at Brandon, offering him a small, supportive nod that felt like a lifeline in a storm. Detective Shaw acted with the kind of courage we expect from every member of this force, Sophie said, her voice ringing with a passionate intensity that silenced the room. He didn't wait for a committee to vote on whether a life was worth saving. He saw a hero dying and he fought for him. Duke was dying regardless of what Brandon did. He didn't make it worse. He gave that dog the only fighting chance he had left. If we punish officers for refusing to give up on their partners, then we've already lost the soul of this department. Miss Caldwell, Miller said dryly, your emotional attachment to the detective is noted, but we are discussing liability and protocol, not soul. The hearing lasted 4 hours. 4 hours of picking apart the frantic, desperate seconds of the trauma bay with the slow, cold fingers of bureaucracy. When it was over, Brandon was asked to wait in the hallway. 10 minutes later, Captain Morales emerged. She didn't look at him as she handed him a manila envelope. The department is placing you on administrative suspension, Brandon, pending a full review by the board and a psychological evaluation. You are to surrender your badge and service weapon to the sergeant-at-arms immediately. Brandon looked at the envelope. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound, echoing exhaustion. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his gold detective shield and set it on the bench beside him. I saved him, Linda, Brandon said softly. I know you did, Morales whispered, her voice finally breaking its professional shell. But you did it in a way that makes everyone else look like they weren't trying hard enough. And they won't forgive you for that. The exit from headquarters was worse. Word had leaked that the decision was coming down, and the sidewalk was a sea of lenses and microphones. Detective Shaw, are you claiming to have a miracle technique? Should police officers be performing veterinary procedures without a license? What do you say to Sergeant Coleman about Duke's death? Brandon pushed through the throng, his head down, the flashes of the cameras like strobe lights in a nightmare. A reporter shoved a microphone toward his face, her eyes bright with the hunt. Detective, why did you do it? Why break the rules? Brandon stopped. He looked into the lens of the camera, his face a mask of weary, unshielded truth. I just didn't want to lose him, he said. He didn't wait for the follow-up. He hailed a cab and disappeared into the gray Metro City drizzle. That night, Brandon's apartment was a cavern of shadows. He didn't turn on the lights. He sat on the floor in the living room, his back against the sofa, watching the city lights blur through the rain-streaked window. Beside him, resting on a thick orthopedic bed, was Blaze. The dog was awake, his head resting on Brandon's thigh. He was still weak, his breathing a bit labored, but his eyes were clear. He watched Brandon with an intensity that seemed to transcend the physical. A silent, ancient bond that didn't need a badge or a protocol to exist. Brandon stroked the soft fur behind Blaze's ears, his hand trembling slightly. I'm sorry, boy, he whispered. I'm sorry they're making this about politics. A soft knock at the door startled him. He didn't move. It's open. Sophie walked in carrying a bag of takeout and a bottle of bourbon. She didn't say anything at first. She just set the food on the coffee table and sat down on the floor beside him. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're not eating," she said, looking at the untouched sandwiches she'd brought. "And I know you haven't slept." "I can't close my eyes, Sophie," Brandon said, his voice hollow. "Every time I do, I'm back in that shipyard. 2 years ago, I lost Titan because I hesitated. I waited for backup. I followed the protocol. And I carried him out in a body bag." He looked at Blaze, his grip tightening ever so slightly. "Now I'm being punished for refusing to hesitate. For doing exactly what they trained us to do, protect our own." "You're not being punished for saving Blaze," Sophie said, her voice gentle but firm. "You're being punished because you did something extraordinary and people don't know how to handle it. You broke the ceiling of what they thought was possible, and now they're terrified of the debris." "Rita hates me," Brandon said, the words catching in his throat. "I can see it in her eyes. I gave her hope and then I watched it die. Miller was right, I played God and I failed." "You didn't fail Duke," Sophie insisted, turning his face toward her. "The car failed Duke. The suspect failed Duke. You were the only person in that room who was willing to stand in the gap between life and death one more time. That's not playing God, Brandon. That's being a partner." Brandon looked at Blaze, then back at Sophie. In the dim light, the isolation he had lived in for 2 years, the wall he had built after Titan, felt like it was finally starting to crumble. But the cost was higher than he had ever imagined. He had his dog, but he had lost his purpose. He had saved a life, but he had become a pariah. "What now?" he asked. "Now," Sophie said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "We wait. We heal. And we remember that even if the whole city turns its back, there's one hero in this room who knows exactly what you're worth." Blaze let out a long, contented sigh and nudged Brandon's hand with his wet nose. Brandon closed his eyes, and for the first time since 4:12 a.m., he didn't see the shipyard. He just felt the warmth of the life he had stolen back from the dark. The storm didn't just arrive, it laid siege to Metro City. For 3 days, the sky had been the color of a fresh bruise, purple and swollen with an atmospheric river that turned the city streets into sluice gates and the Blackwood River into a churning, mud-choked monster. It was the kind of weather that felt biblical, the kind that made people stay inside and bolt their doors, sensing that the natural order was temporarily suspended. For Brandon Shaw, the weather matched the internal landscape of his life. 3 weeks of administrative suspension had turned his apartment into a claustrophobic cell. His badge sat in a drawer in the kitchen, a cold piece of gold that felt like it belonged to a dead man. He had spent his days in a cycle of restless pacing and staring at the rain, his identity stripped away, replaced by the stinging label of reckless that the department had branded into his skin. He was a detective who couldn't detect, a handler who had no authority, and a savior who was being treated like a criminal. The only thing keeping the walls from closing in completely was Blaze. The dog's recovery had been nothing short of a medical anomaly. While the department's lawyers argued over liability, Blaze's body had simply decided to live. He was thinner, a jagged scar tracing a path across his side where the blade had nearly ended him, but the light in his eyes was back, piercing, intelligent, and fiercely loyal. Because of the ongoing investigation, Blaze was officially housed at Sophie's apartment to keep Brandon away from department property, a technicality that felt like a knife in Brandon's gut every single night. At 4:45 p.m., the wind shifted, a violent gust rattling Brandon's windows so hard he thought the glass would shatter. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was Sophie. Her voice wasn't its usual calm, paramedic steady self. It was thin, vibrating with an urgent frequency. "Brandon, something is wrong with Blaze." Brandon was already grabbing his keys. "Is he crashing? Is it the heart?" "No, it's not physical. It's his head," Sophie said. Through the line, Brandon could hear a sound that made his blood run cold. Blaze was howling. It wasn't the play bark of a dog wanting a treat or the warning growl of a guardian. It was the high-pitched, mourning keen of a tracker who had caught the scent of a soul in transit. "He's been pacing the door for 20 minutes. He's scratching the wood raw. Brandon, he's acting like he's on a hot track. He's frantic. I'm coming to you. Don't let him out." "Brandon, turn on the news," Sophie whispered. "The Blackwood Bridge. A school bus." Brandon didn't need the news. He could hear the sirens now, a distant, dissonant choir rising from the direction of the river. He threw on his heavy canvas jacket, no longer tactical, just a civilian garment that felt too light for the storm, and bolted out the door. The scene at the Blackwood Bridge was a vision of hell. A yellow school bus, twisted and mangled like a discarded toy, lay nose down in the roiling, gray-brown waters of the Blackwood River. It had skidded off the icy grate of the bridge, plunging 30 feet into the current. The river was at flood stage, moving with a terrifying, silent power, logs and debris battering the metal carcass of the vehicle. Emergency lights, red, blue and amber, turned the falling rain into a kaleidoscope of chaos. Fire trucks, ambulances and police cruisers lined the banks. Divers in black neoprene were fighting the current, their safety lines taut as they tried to reach the submerged rear of the bus. Brandon arrived just as Sophie's car skidded to a halt nearby. Blaze didn't wait for the door to fully open. He surged out, his nose hitting the air with a violent, searching intensity. He didn't look like a dog that had been clinically dead 3 weeks ago. He looked like an arrow released from a bow. "Brandon, wait!" Sophie shouted, running after them. Brandon didn't wait. He didn't have a badge, he didn't have a radio, and he didn't have permission. But he had Blaze. And Blaze was dragging him toward the riverbank with a strength that defied his scars. They reached the command post, a huddle of high-ranking officers and fire chiefs standing around a topographic map spread over a hood. Captain Morales was there, her face a mask of grim determination beneath the brim of her rain-slicked hat. She looked up as Brandon approached, her eyes widening. "Shaw, what the hell are you doing here? You're on suspension." "The dog wouldn't stop," Brandon said, his voice level despite the adrenaline screaming in his veins. "What's the count?" Morales hesitated, then sighed, the weight of the tragedy overriding the protocol. 14 children on board. We've pulled 13. Most are being treated for hypothermia and minor injuries. But we're missing one. Emma Torres, 7 years old. The divers have been through the cabin twice. They can't find her. The current is too strong and the visibility is 0. The fire chief stepped over, shaking his head. The rear of the bus is wedged into a mud bank. We think she might have been swept out a broken window. We're moving the search downstream, but in this current, if she's in the water, we're looking for a recovery, not a rescue. Blaze let out a sharp, piercing bark. He wasn't looking downstream. He was looking at the bus, specifically at a section of the roof that was pinned against a jagged concrete pylon of the bridge. He began to pull, his claws digging into the mud, his body leaning toward the water with a desperate, singular focus. "He's got her," Brandon said, his heart hammering. "Detective, the divers searched that section," the chief said firmly. "There's nothing there but twisted metal and an air pocket that's about to collapse." "The divers are looking for a body," Brandon snapped, already stripping off his jacket and boots. "Blaze is looking for a heartbeat. There's a difference." "Brandon, don't," Sophie whispered, grabbing his arm. "The water is freezing. You'll go into shock in minutes." Brandon looked at her, then at the river. He thought about Titan. He thought about the shipyard. He thought about the look on Rita Coleman's face when Duke didn't wake up. If he stayed on this bank, he was just a man watching a clock. If he went in, he was a partner. "Blaze, find her," Brandon commanded. The dog didn't hesitate. He plunged into the icy, churning water. Blaze struggled against the current, his powerful legs churning the gray silt, heading straight for the pylon. Brandon followed, the cold hitting him like a physical blow, 1,000 needles of ice piercing his skin. The shock threatened to steal his breath, his lungs seizing, but he focused on the golden brown head bobbing in the water ahead of him. They reached the pylon. The water was screaming here, a roar of hydraulic pressure as the river tried to crush the bus against the concrete. Blaze was scratching at a small, jagged opening in the roof, his muzzle submerged, blowing bubbles as he searched. Brandon grabbed a piece of protruding rebar and pulled himself under. The world went dark and silent, the roar of the river replaced by the muffled, metallic groans of the bus. He felt his way through the murky water, his hands brushing against floating backpacks and seat cushions. His lungs were burning, the cold leaching the strength from his limbs. He reached the air pocket Blaze had signaled. It was tiny, less than a foot of space between the water and the ceiling of the bus. He broke the surface, gasping for air that smelled of diesel and fear. And there, wedged into a corner behind a collapsed seat, was a small, blue-clad figure. Emma Torres. Her head was tilted back, her face barely above the rising water. Her eyes were closed, her skin the color of a winter sky. "I've got you," Brandon wheezed, though she couldn't hear him. He grabbed her, tucking her small, limp body against his chest. She was impossibly cold, the kind of cold that feels like it belongs to the earth, not a child. He kicked off the seat, diving back into the murk, his muscles screaming as he fought the current that tried to pin them inside the wreckage. He emerged from the water, gasping, Blaze swimming circles around him, barking a triumphant, frantic signal to the shore. "I've got her. I've got her," Brandon roared. The rescue team pulled them onto the muddy bank. Brandon collapsed on the grass, his body shaking so violently he could barely hold onto the girl. Paramedics swarmed, their movements a blur of neon green and white. Sophie was there instantly, her hands moving to Emma's neck, her face pale. "No pulse," a paramedic shouted, beginning standard chest compressions. "She's cold, she's blue. Pupils are fixed. She's been under too long." The water was 38 degrees, the fire chief said, looking down with a heavy, resigned sadness. "The mammalian dive reflex only goes so far. At this age, with this much exposure, she's gone." Brandon sat up, his teeth chattering, his hands raw and bleeding from the metal in the bus. He looked at Emma. She was 7. She had a My Little Pony sticker on her backpack. She was a world that was about to end. Then he felt the hum. It was a strange, vibrating energy in the air. He looked up. 3 news helicopters were hovering low, their searchlights pinning the scene like a specimen on a board. The cameras were rolling. The entire city was watching. If he did it now, if he tried the pressure cascade, and he failed, it would be the final nail in his coffin. It would be a public execution of his career. It would be Duke all over again, but this time on national television. "Brandon," Sophie whispered, her eyes meeting his. She saw the hesitation. She saw the fear. "The standard CPR isn't working. The hypothermia has locked her heart. You know what to do." "I'm on suspension, Sophie," Brandon rasped, his voice trembling. "If I touch her, if I fail, save her. Please." The scream came from behind the police line. A woman, Emma's mother, was being held back by 2 officers. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated agony. It was the same scream Brandon had heard for 2 years in his dreams. It was the sound of the shipyard. Brandon looked at Blaze. The dog was standing over Emma, his tail still, his eyes fixed on Brandon. "The mission isn't over, partner," the look said. Brandon pushed the paramedics aside. "Detective, what are you doing?" Captain Morales shouted, stepping forward. "The cameras are right there. If you do this and it goes wrong, I can't protect you." "I don't need protection," Brandon said, his voice suddenly dropping into that deep, resonant calm. "I need her to breathe." He knelt over Emma. But he didn't use the canine technique. His mind raced back to the gray space training. The pediatric adaptation, Thorne had said, is about the dive reflex. You have to fool the brain into thinking the water is gone while stimulating the vagal response to override the freeze. Brandon positioned his hands. It was different for a child. The pressure had to be lighter, the frequency higher. His left hand didn't go to the neck. It went to the carotid sinus, his thumb applying a precise, vibratory pressure. His right hand moved to the center of her chest, but he didn't use his palms. He used his fingertips, creating a rapid, cascading rhythm that mimicked a frantic heartbeat. Pulse, pulse, strike. Pulse, pulse, strike. "He's doing it again," a reporter's voice echoed from a nearby camera crew. "The suspended detective is performing the miracle technique on the missing child." Brandon tuned it all out. The helicopters, the shouting, the cold, it all vanished. He was back in the hangar. He was back in the safe house. "Come on, Emma. Don't let the river win. Break the ice. Flip the breaker." 1 minute passed. 2. "Brandon, her core temp is too low," Sophie whispered, monitoring the girl's vitals. "The heart won't fire in this state." "Yes, it will," Brandon hissed. He shifted his pressure, moving his fingers to the nerve clusters behind her jaw. He leaned down, his breath hot against her frozen cheek. "Emma, my name is Brandon. I'm a friend of Blaze's. He found you. He's waiting for you to wake up so he can show you his medal. Don't make him wait, Emma. Don't you dare." He delivered a sharp, precision strike to the sternum, a pediatric thump, and immediately followed it with a rapid-fire cascade of neural stimulation. The silence on the riverbank was absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Thud, pulse, pulse. Nothing. Thud, pulse, pulse. Nothing. "Brandon?" Morales started, her voice soft with pity. Suddenly, Emma's body arched. It wasn't a small tremor. It was a violent, full-body convulsion. Her mouth opened and a torrent of river water spilled out onto the mud. Her chest gave a jagged, rattling heave. Cough. Gasp. Emma's eyes flew open. They were wild, dilated, and full of the terror of the dark, but they were alive. "She's breathing," Sophie screamed, diving forward with the oxygen mask. "We have a pulse. Strong. It's holding." The riverbank didn't just erupt, it exploded. The officers, the firemen, the crowd behind the line, they all let out a roar of triumph that drowned out the sound of the storm. Emma's mother broke through the line, collapsing into the mud beside her daughter, sobbing, "Thank you, over and over again like a litany. Brandon stood up slowly. He was shivering, his skin blue, his strength completely spent. He looked up at the helicopters. He knew what they had seen. They hadn't seen a reckless detective. They had seen a miracle. Blaze walked over to him, leaning his heavy weight against Brandon's leg. Brandon reached down and buried his hand in the dog's wet fur. He looked at Captain Morales. She was standing 10 feet away, her hat off, her eyes shining with tears. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The backlash had just been washed away by the river. Brandon Shaw had walked into the water a pariah. He walked out a man who had finally, truly, come home from the shipyard. "Good job, Blaze," Brandon whispered, his voice lost in the cheers. "Mission accomplished." In the digital age, the truth does not travel, it erupts. The footage from the Blackwood River rescue didn't just lead the evening news, it saturated the global consciousness within 3 hours. It was a masterpiece of raw, unedited human drama. Captured in high definition by the hovering news helicopters, the scene played out like a cinematic epic. The churning, obsidian water of the river, the flickering strobe of emergency lights, and the solitary figure of a man in the mud, refusing to let a child slip into the dark. Every news outlet from Metro City to London ran the clip. They analyzed it frame by frame. They showed the moment Brandon's fingers moved in that strange, rhythmic dance across the girl's throat. They showed the precise, desperate strike to her chest. And most importantly, they showed the moment Emma Torres's body jolted back to life. The audio, captured by a long-range directional mic, broadcast Brandon's raw, guttural command to the girl to not make Blaze wait. The public narrative, which had been so eager to crucify the reckless detective only days prior, shifted with the violent suddenness of a tectonic plate. The hashtags changed overnight. Hashtag Playing God was replaced by hashtag The Lazarus Detective. The same talking heads who had questioned Brandon's sanity now interviewed pediatric cardiologists and elite search and rescue divers who stared at the footage with a mixture of professional awe and quiet reverence. 4 days after the river rescue, Brandon found himself back at Metro City Police Headquarters. This time there were no cameras in the lobby. There were no reporters screaming questions about liability. The atmosphere was different, thick with a heavy, respectful silence that followed him like a wake as he walked toward the captain's office. He wasn't wearing his dress blues. He was in jeans and a thermal shirt, his hands still bandaged from the jagged metal of the bus. He felt raw, exposed, as if the river had stripped away the last of his professional armor. Inside the office, Captain Linda Morales was standing by the window, watching the rain, now a gentle drizzle, wash the soot from the city streets. Beside her desk stood Agent Miller from Internal Affairs. Miller looked like a man who had been forced to swallow a bag of nails. "Sit down, Brandon," Morales said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. Brandon sat. He didn't look at the manila envelope on her desk. He didn't care about the paperwork anymore. "The board met last night," Morales began, turning to face him. "They spent 6 hours reviewing the footage from the bridge alongside a consultant we brought in, a chief medical officer from the Navy Special Operations Command. He recognized your technique, Brandon. He called it the last ditch of the desperate, and said it saved more K-9s in the field than the public will ever know." She leaned forward, her hands interlaced. The Medical Review Board for the city's Pediatric Trauma Center also submitted their findings. "They've concluded that Emma Torres would be brain dead today if you hadn't intervened. Your adaptation of the neurostimulation for a hypothermic drowning victim was, in their words, precise, appropriate, and brilliantly intuitive." Agent Miller cleared his throat, a sharp, dry sound in the quiet room. He looked at Brandon, his gray eyes devoid of their previous ice, replaced by a grudging, professional respect. "The investigation into medical misconduct is officially closed, Detective," Miller said, the words sounding like they were being pulled out of him with pliers. "The footage, it proves your technique has merit in specific high-stakes circumstances. The department is not only lifting your suspension, we are expunging the disciplinary record regarding the Blaze incident. We cannot ignore the fact that the experimental method we tried to bury just saved the life of a 7-year-old on national television." Morales pushed the gold shield across the desk. It caught the morning light, shimmering with a renewed, hard-won brilliance. "Welcome back, Detective," she said. "But we aren't putting you back on the street. Not yet. The commissioner wants to talk to you about a new initiative. He wants you to turn this voodoo science into a formalized K-9 medical response protocol. If there are lives to be saved using what you know, we want our people trained to save them." Brandon picked up the badge. He felt the weight of it in his palm, the cold metal, the history it represented. For the first time in 2 years, it didn't feel like a burden. Felt like a tool. "I have one condition," Brandon said, looking Morales in the eye. "Name it." "I don't do it alone. I want Sophie Caldwell as the lead medical consultant. We don't just need tactical medicine, we need trauma expertise. And I want Blaze as the lead training dog." Morales smiled, a genuine weary smile. "I think the city would riot if we said no." 6 months later. The training facility on the outskirts of Metro City smelled of fresh sawdust, high-grade rubber, and the unmistakable energetic scent of working dogs. It was a state-of-the-art hub, funded by a surge of public donations and departmental grants that had followed the Blackwood River rescue. Brandon stood on the observation deck, watching a group of 8 canine handlers practicing a low-intensity version of the neural stimulation technique on anatomical models. Beside him, Blaze sat with the regal poise of a king. The dog had made a full recovery. His coat was thick and glossy, and while the long, jagged scar on his side remained, a permanent map of his sacrifice, he moved with more power and agility than he ever had before. He was no longer just a tracker, he was the living proof of the program's success. "They're getting better," a voice said from behind him. Brandon turned. Sophie was leaning against the railing, her hair tied back, a tablet in her hand filled with physiological data from the morning sessions. Over the last 6 months, she had transitioned from the field into this new role, helping Brandon translate Master Sergeant Thorne's gray space techniques into a curriculum that was safe, repeatable, and medically sound. "They're starting to understand that it's not about force," Brandon said, looking back at the handlers. "It's about the rhythm. It's about listening to the body's own electricity." "You're a good teacher, Brandon," Sophie said softly. "I'm just a man who didn't want to lose any more friends," he replied. The sun was beginning to set, casting long amber shadows across the training floor. The facility grew quiet as the handlers began to crate their dogs for the night. "Coffee?" Sophie asked. "I think we've earned it." They sat in the small break room, the windows overlooking the darkened training fields. The only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator and the rhythmic, contented tail thump of Blaze, who was sleeping at Brandon's feet. The steam rose from their mugs in the quiet, dim light. For a long time neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't awkward. It was the comfortable, heavy silence of two people who had survived a war together. "You know," Sophie said, breaking the quiet as she stared into her cup, "we've spent 6 months building this unit. We've written 300 pages of protocol. We've trained 50 officers. But you never actually told me, Brandon. Why? I mean, I know you saw Thorne do it in the desert. But that's not why you memorized every nerve ending and every pressure point." Brandon looked out the window. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the distance, a sea of flickering stars. He thought about the shipyard. He thought about the smell of salt water and the sound of Titan's final labored breath. 2 years ago, Brandon began, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly register. "I lost my previous partner, Titan. We were in a pursuit through the old docks. I thought I could handle it. I wanted the collar. I hesitated to call for backup because I didn't want to share the win." He paused, his hand tightening around the mug until his knuckles turned white. "Titan took the bullet that was meant for my chest. And then he sat there in the back of my car and he watched me. He didn't whimper. He didn't bark. He just looked at me with this absolute faith, like he knew I was going to fix it. And I couldn't do anything, Sophie. I held him and I watched the light go out of his eyes, and I was completely, utterly helpless." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes shining with a raw, ancient grief. "I swore that night that I would never be helpless again. I went looking for every experimental technique, every forbidden medical field guide, every miracle Thorne had ever whispered about. I didn't learn the pressure cascade because I wanted to be a hero. I learned it because I couldn't live with the silence of that car ride ever again." Sophie didn't look away. She didn't offer a platitude. She reached across the small laminate table and placed her hand over his. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the cold memories Brandon was reliving. "You're not helpless anymore, Brandon," she said, her voice a steady, grounding tether. "But you need to understand something. You saved Blaze and you saved Emma. But even with all the techniques in the world, you're still just human. You can't control the river and you can't control the bullets. And that has to be enough." Brandon looked down at their joined hands. The calluses on his fingers met the softness of hers. It was a connection built on shared trauma, on the long nights in the ICU, and on the terrifying, beautiful moments where they had stood together at the edge of the abyss. "Is it enough?" Brandon asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sophie squeezed his hand, her thumb stroking the back of his wrist. It's more than enough. You gave them a second chance. And maybe it's time you gave yourself one too. Brandon felt a strange, unfamiliar sensation in his chest, a loosening of a knot that had been tied tight for 2 years. He looked down at Blaze, who let out a soft, dreaming huff in his sleep. New beginnings, Brandon said, the words feeling right for the first time. New beginnings, Sophie echoed. They sat there in the quiet of the facility, two survivors holding onto each other in the dark, watching the city lights and knowing that while they couldn't save everyone, they were no longer standing in the shipyard alone. The air in Washington, D.C., carried a different kind of weight than the humid, soot-heavy atmosphere of Metro City. It was crisp, smelling of ancient stone, manicured lawns, and the cold, dignified breath of history. Under the silver sky of a late autumn morning, the white marble of the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial seemed to glow with an inner light, a silent sentinel for the thousands of names etched into its curving walls. Detective Brandon Shaw stood at the edge of the memorial's pathway, his hands deep in the pockets of his dark wool overcoat. For a long time he just stared at the low walls. He wasn't looking for his own name, though there had been a night in the Riverside Trauma Center where that outcome felt like a coin toss. He was looking at the spaces between the names, the invisible gaps where the stories of the four-legged partners lived. Beside him, Blaze sat in a perfect, disciplined stay. The dog was a vision of recovered power. His coat had returned to its deep, obsidian and mahogany luster, and the tactical harness he wore, the one with the Metro City K9 insignia, fit him like a second skin. To the casual tourist passing by, he was a beautiful animal. To Brandon, he was a breathing, walking testament to the fact that sometimes the dark doesn't get to win. Brandon reached down and felt the cool, smooth stone of the wall. He thought of Titan. He thought of the shipyard, the rain, and the silence. For 2 years, that silence had been a cage. Today, in the presence of so much honored history, the cage felt like it had finally dissolved into the wind. He knows, you know, a soft voice said. Brandon didn't have to turn to know it was Sophie. She was wearing a tailored navy suit, her hair pinned back in a way that made her look both professional and strikingly elegant. She stepped up beside him, her shoulder brushing his. Knows what? Brandon asked. That you're finally at peace with it, she said, looking at the wall. Titan didn't die because you weren't enough, Brandon. He died so you could become the man who was enough for Blaze. And for Emma. And for everyone you're going to train. Brandon let out a long breath, the steam of it vanishing into the DC air. It's a hell of a price to pay for a lesson, Sophie. The most important ones usually are, she replied gently. She reached down and scratched Blaze behind the ears. The dog leaned into her touch, his tail giving a single rhythmic thump against the pavement. Come on. The commissioner is waiting. And I think there's a 7-year-old girl who's about to burst from excitement. The great hall of the Department of Justice was a cathedral of American law, vaulted ceilings, echoing footsteps, and the heavy scent of floor wax and tradition. Hundreds of people filled the rows of mahogany chairs, high-ranking officials in gold-braided uniforms, senators, families of the fallen, and a massive contingent of K9 handlers from across the country who had flown in to see the dog that had broken the rules and lived. Brandon sat in the front row, his back straight, his eyes fixed on the stage. He felt a strange sense of displacement. 6 months ago, he was a man waiting for his badge to be taken away. Today he was the guest of honor. The ceremony began with the presentation of colors, the sharp snap of the flag and the mournful, stirring notes of the national anthem. Then Commissioner Hayes stepped to the podium. He was a man with a face like a mountain, craggy, weathered, and immovable. We are here today to talk about loyalty, Hayes began, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that filled every corner of the hall. In law enforcement, we talk a lot about the thin blue line. We talk about the bond between partners. But today we recognize a partner who doesn't wear a badge, who doesn't draw a salary, and who never asks for anything more than a pat on the head and a mission to fulfill. He looked down at the front row, his eyes finding Blaze. 6 months ago, K9 Blaze of the Metro City Police Department faced a situation that would have ended the story for most. He took a blade meant for a citizen. He bled out on a cold floor. He was declared dead. But the bond between a handler and his dog is a circuit that doesn't break just because a heart stops beating. Hayes paused, his expression softening. Blaze represents the best of K9 service, courage, resilience, and an absolute refusal to give up. And because he refused to give up, a 7-year-old girl is alive today. Because he refused to give up, a new path has been forged in how we care for our tactical partners. The commissioner gestured toward the side of the stage. To present the National K9 Medal of Valor, I'd like to invite a very special guest to the podium. Miss Emma Torres." The room erupted in applause as a small girl in a bright yellow dress walked onto the stage. She moved with a slight, playful skip, her dark curls bouncing. She looked healthy, her cheeks flush with life, her eyes bright and clear. Behind her, her mother walked with a hand on Emma's shoulder, her face wet with tears of joy. Brandon felt a lump in his throat that threatened to choke him. Seeing Emma stand there, vibrant and whole, was a better medal than anything they could cast in bronze. "Detective Shaw, Blaze, please join us on stage," the commissioner commanded. Brandon stood, his legs feeling a bit like lead. He gave a sharp, silent hand signal. Blaze stood instantly, his head up, his gait proud and steady as they ascended the stairs. As they reached the center of the stage, Emma didn't wait for the formal protocol. She broke away from her mother and ran straight to Blaze. The dog, usually a statue of tactical discipline, lowered his head and allowed the little girl to throw her arms around his neck in a massive, crushing hug. The audience let out a collective, "Ah," and even the sternest generals on the stage found themselves smiling. Emma pulled back, her face beaming. She took the velvet box from the commissioner's hand. Inside was a heavy, gold medal suspended on a blue and red ribbon. On the face of the medal was the image of a German shepherd in profile, surrounded by the words, "Fidelitas et fortitudo," loyalty and strength. "Thank you for finding me, Blaze," Emma whispered, her voice carrying through the house microphones. She stood on her tiptoes and with Brandon's help, she looped the ribbon over Blaze's head. The medal settled against the dog's chest, clinking softly against his department tags. Blaze gave a sharp, happy bark, his tail wagging with enough force to thump against Brandon's leg. Commissioner Hayes then turned his attention to Brandon. "Detective Shaw, for your extraordinary actions, your innovative thinking, and your unwavering commitment to your partner, the department is officially promoting you to the rank of lieutenant. Furthermore, you are hereby appointed as the National Director of the newly created K9 Medical Response Unit." Hayes handed Brandon a new set of silver bars. "You didn't just save a dog, Lieutenant. You changed the way we think about the impossible. You've given every handler in this country a new set of tools to ensure their partners come home. Your promotion is effective immediately." Brandon took the bars, his hand steady. "Thank you, Commissioner. But the credit belongs to the dog. He's the one who decided to stay." The reception after the ceremony was a blur of handshakes, flashes, and congratulations. Brandon saw Rita Coleman in the crowd, the sergeant who had lost Duke. She approached him slowly, her expression no longer bitter, but contemplative. "I watched the footage of the bridge, Brandon," Rita said, her voice quiet. "I saw what you did for that girl. And I finally understood." "Rita, I'm so sorry about Duke," Brandon said, the words coming from a place of deep, shared understanding. "I know you are," she said, reaching out to pat Blaze's head. "I was angry because I wanted a miracle and I didn't get one. But seeing you here, seeing the program you're building, it means that maybe the next Duke out there will have a better chance. That's a legacy worth having." She gave him a firm, professional nod and disappeared back into the crowd. It wasn't a perfect resolution, the grief was still there, but the poison was gone. Late that evening, after the crowds had dispersed and the marble halls of the Capitol had grown quiet, Brandon and Sophie walked through the park near the Lincoln Memorial. The reflection pool was a sheet of dark glass, mirroring the pillars of the monument. Blaze walked between them, the Medal of Valor still around his neck, jingling softly with every step. "Lieutenant Shaw," Sophie said, testing the words out. "It has a nice ring to it, though I think Blaze is the one who's really going to let it go to his head. He's already expecting extra steaks for dinner." "He's earned a lifetime of steaks," Brandon said, looking at the dog. They stopped near the edge of the water. The monuments were lit up against the night sky, a landscape of enduring strength. Brandon looked at Sophie. The last 6 months had been a journey through fire, but standing here now, he realized that he hadn't just saved a dog or a child. He had saved himself. "So, what's next for the famous detective?" "Excuse me, Lieutenant Shaw?" Sophie asked, a playful glint in her eyes. Brandon looked at Blaze, then back at the woman who had stood by him through the trauma, the suspension, and the miracles. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "More training," Brandon said. "More lives saved. And maybe—" He looked at her meaningfully, his voice dropping into a softer, more intimate tone. Sophie smiled, stepping closer into the circle of his warmth. "Maybe what?" "Maybe figuring out how to let someone in again," Brandon said. "Truly in. No walls. No shipyards." Sophie leaned up and kissed him gently, a promise of a future that wasn't defined by the ghosts of the past. I think you're already doing a pretty good job of that. Blaze let out a sharp, approving bark, his tail wagging furiously as he looked up at them. He nudged Brandon's hand with his cold nose, reminding him that while the medals were nice and the promotions were grand, the mission was simple. Brandon knelt beside Blaze, fastening the medal more securely against his harness. He looked into the dog's deep, brown eyes, the eyes that had seen the dark and chosen to return. "Loyalty isn't about never failing, boy," Brandon whispered, pressing his forehead against the dog's. "It's about showing up even when you're scared. It's about refusing to quit on those who would never quit on you." As they walked away into the DC night, the lieutenant, the medic, and the hero, Brandon realized that the pressure cascade wasn't just a medical technique. It was a metaphor for life. Sometimes, when the heart stalls and the world goes cold, you just have to keep pushing until the spark comes back. Because as long as you're standing there, nobody gets to give up. Brandon refused to turn his back on Blaze when the entire world told him it was over. He stayed when the heart monitor flatlined and the room went cold. "Are you really going to walk away from their story now?" Blaze fought for every breath to stay with us. "The least you can do is take 1 second to hit that like button. If you believe that loyalty like theirs should never be forgotten, subscribe to join our unit. Don't let this hero's journey end in silence. Comment, 'Good boy,' below so Blaze knows he's finally home."